Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Osquery Office Hours. It is the beginning of November, and at least here in the US, it's election day. Not sure where that is everywhere else, but I hope everyone's doing great. Let's see, announcements and highlights. Maybe I'll mention that just prior to the meeting, we were discussing that Chris posted an article about Charvel's MacOS FimWork. So go Charvel, and I guess go Chris. But maybe that's all I've got for announcements. Other folks? Okay. Next up, questions, issues, PRs people want to discuss. The intent here is sort of just an open section for anyone to bring something up that they maybe didn't feel comfortable making into a agenda item or just didn't know how.
Nothing particularly, but someone pinged and asked like if we stapled the notarization ticket on the PKGs. And I checked and we don't. And I wonder if we can. It looks simple, but of course not a deal breaker. But maybe at some point we should update our build and sign workflow to staple the notarization.
Sorry, I'm taking a note into the minutes about that. So the reason that ends up being a little bit hard is there's an undefined time delay between when you notarize and when you can staple.
Yeah.
So it collide the way we do this is one thing does the build and submits to notary, and then like an hour later, some other thing will come by and sort of move them around and do any stapling that we want to have happen.
Steph, that's when you're talking about that time delay, you're talking about how long Apple takes to complete the notarization. You're not talking about there's not a delay after the notarization is completed and before you can staple, right? You're just
Correct.
talking about after the submission.
Yep.
Do we use a notary tool in our process?
I think so.
Because there's a flag that has it wait until the notarization completes.
I've always wanted to avoid burning the GitHub minutes because I don't really understand that, but maybe it's fine. Or maybe the other thing I'm thinking.
Can I jump in here and say that
Please.
Stapling isn't necessary? Stapling is only required if the device is offline.
So there's another.
Exactly. That was the use case they had. They didn't want a connection out, a remote connection from. But again, it's just someone asked this question,
so they can also do the stapling themselves. Like anyone can staple. There's no Apple credentials even necessary. There's no veracity in the act of stapling.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, anyone can staple, but you don't even need creds. It's just I'm 90% sure you don't staple on the downloaded binary. It's basically the same as executing it because it'll get the hash, fetch the certificate, and then just merge them together. So anyone can staple. So
yeah, I just wanted to confirm, like, if we just like left it because we were in a rush, or was it just because that there's a kind of we don't have a good way to do it because Apple takes a long time?
We left it because of the time delay. It's worth revisiting that because since we originally wrote all of this, there is now a wait option, and the time delay is now usually down in the minute range, not the like 15 minutes it used to be prior.
Yeah, and you're concerned about the minutes because this is a private repo,
It's in a private repo. We don't actually pay for it, but I have no idea what the capacity is.
Oh, well, I don't know if it's the same as what Fleet Experience is, but with public repos, you get unlimited minutes.
Right.
There's a concurrency limit, but it's fairly high. Like I think we're probably nowhere close to hitting it on the Osquery org. So I would encourage us to not worry too much about those minutes and
That's
just
probably
try
reasonable.
going for it.
I mean, so it's a private repo, but we have an open source account, so it's basically, I think, like a free team account, and I've never really looked very hard at it. I would suggest just PRing it, but I wouldn't, because I had just rewrote that all and I haven't merged those PRs yet. We could probably just try tossing a weight on it and see what happens. It's not the end of the world.
Charvel,
Okay.
is that something that you want to do?
Yeah, sounds good. I can do it. And yeah, I've also reviewed that CodeSign PR. Looks good. We also did the 5.10.2 release with it. So
Yeah, I remember you had a couple of comments on it.
Yeah, they were more like curiosity questions, like why we.
Yeah, you don't even
But yeah,
need the XD run, JD.
Yeah.
You can just staple directly. I guess it depends on your path, excuse me. Okay, yeah, I think I'm going to merge my refactoring. If you want to pick up any of your comments and just iterate on them at the same time you add a weight and staple, that seems fine.
Okay.
Is my face clean?
And I think with this merge, there'll be a more clear base.
Sounds good. I'll
okay.
pick it up after you hit merge.
Yeah, I'll try and reply to those comments just if you want context on them or something. But okay, cool. I'll type some more meeting notes too when I'm not also talking at the same time. Okay. Any other questions about that?
No.
Okay. Back, yes, do it. Brilliant. Zach proposes removing the Atom extensions table.
Okay, I'll do it. Great. Just figured I'd check in here. See if there's buy-in. Sounds good. We can move on.
I happened to notice that table the other day too, and I was like, oh, we should get rid of that.
Yeah.
Well, that's our agenda. I might have a couple of questions for folks. I don't know if anyone knows the answer, but I'll ask. I sometimes see in the Collide customer base, I sometimes see hangs on Windows, and it feels like some query sometimes hangs a thread. So like I'll see the distributed execution thread hang, but not the scheduled thread hang, or vice versa. And I haven't yet traced this to a query or to a table. So I don't know if it's an Osquery or in Launcher. And for no good reason, I suspect it's in WMI. But I'm curious if anyone else has seen anything like this.
I mean, have seen hangs in Osquery in various ways over time. I don't think that we've seen consistent hangs in Windows recently.
Yeah. I also like, that's a little related, but so Osquery gets the Windows version through a WMI call, if I remember right, which Windows release it is. And we just got some user try and enroll, but Osquery couldn't talk to WMI. So the Windows version came back as -1, which was not a hang, but was super weird. So I kind of, I don't know, I think WMI is some really complicated subsystem that probably we get lots of pain talking to, and I don't know that we have a better answer, but I noticed that the other day. Anyhow, fun Windows things.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting if you had some mechanism to get like a core dump and backtrace to see if you could identify what might be hanging. You think that you've seen it on both sides of scheduled and distributed?
I think so, yeah. But that doesn't, if it's a query that triggers it sometimes, Collide runs everything across both depending on context. So what seems more interesting is that I'll see like one of the threads hang and the other one is still operating. So it feels very much like one query sometimes triggers a hang on that thread, but the other thread is still up. So I don't totally know yet. Also mentioned that Collide still doesn't run the watchdog, so maybe the watchdog would notice and clean everything up.
I don't think it would. I don't think the watchdog is like looking out for hung threads. Like it's really just looking at resource utilization. If there's something that was like spinning and pegging a CPU, then yeah, then it would do that.
Well, if we figure anything out, I'll end up, there'll be issues or PRs to one of the repositories.
Yeah, sounds good.
But I don't know. I don't know what's up on that. Maybe other.
Do you know if this is virtualized Windows boxes like VMware or Hypervisor?
No, they're real.
They're real. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I see it on real laptops. So, yeah. Other exciting things. Micah is most of the way through a version comparison.
Oh yeah, is it the collation?
Yeah. So that'll be pretty cool. Code is a little bit. I think the code is reasonable, but it's biased towards a particular algorithm to cut down on allocations and make it faster. Because if you're trying to sort a whole table of things, you kind of care. So anyhow, it's kind of a neat PR. I think it'll be fun once we get that one in. Oh yeah, I had okay. Bouncing back to a much earlier conversation that we have had. Do people remember discussing questions about how do we manage? Okay, so Collide and maybe also Fleet has frequently run into a problem where there's like, we really want to run a query at startup. Right? Like startup, you really want to run this query. And I've floated this idea of what would it be like if we flagged some queries as run on startup? And then we talked about this a couple office hours ago. And the problem that we ran into was that if you run something at startup, then if you have a bunch of queries that are set to run hourly and you run them all at startup, they end up in sync. So that does weird load things. You do better spread out. And also if everyone kind of turns their machines on at about the same time, like everything ends up clumped together. And I realized that I think the way around that is that run on startup is sort of a different, doesn't affect the scheduler, right? So you can imagine a query. Right now we have queries that have a schedule on them. You can imagine a query that has a schedule and or a run at startup flag, right? And if it has run at startup, then it runs when Osquery starts or when the pack is loaded. And if it also is a schedule, the scheduler does whatever it would have done anyhow. Like that first one is like off timing period, right? So maybe the first one runs at T0 when Osquery comes up and the scheduler says, oh, every hour, well, I'm going to run this in 5 minutes, and then every hour since. So like that first one doesn't count to the initial timing.
I don't think I'm actually following the concern about the timing with the schedule. Like, how in terms of them being synchronized, with the run at startup, how is that going to be different from currently where it doesn't run at startup, but it does run on an interval, and we basically just rely on if the Osquery processes start at the same time that the splay helps to
I think
desynchronize them.
there's a couple of things that we have today, and some of this is a little hearsay to me. Actually, you might know better. I don't know. One of the pieces is if you imagine, so one of them is device specific and the other one is fleet specific, right? So on a device, we often run queries on an hour cadence, right?
Yeah.
And if we had them run at boot, then at every hour after boot, the entire set of queries would run en masse, right? So if those queries had some load component, you'd see a load spike every hour. So on a device level, letting that splay out over the hour, which is what happens today, works, right? I think when the scheduler starts, it doesn't start at 0. It kind of just chucks queries into whatever bucket it feels like. That's my understanding.
No, I think it's actually more like the default splay is something like 10%, if I remember.
10%.
And I think that what happens is when Osquery starts up, it's going to schedule the query between 54 and 66 seconds out from startup,
Right.
essentially. And so I'm not sure how running it at startup would change that. Like it would run at startup, which definitely would be a load spike because all the queries presumably would run it at startup, or all the ones that were
Configured,
configured that way. But then they would all be splayed with their random splay the same
So you don't. Okay, if that's true, then my understanding is wrong, and it would be no change.
I also feel like similarly, like Zach mentioned, like there will be the initial run at load spike, but after that, display would kind of spread them around.
Okay, I was under the impression that the scheduler doesn't set start at 0. It sets it at. It just picks a random time to start each query to splay them out. But if you say no, it starts at T0 and uses splay, then I'm totally wrong, and running some at boot would be fine.
I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm, let's say, like 80. I would have said 95.
I'm just repeating
before
things
I heard
people told me.
I heard you say that.
I'm just
No.
repeating things people told me in the last office hours about this. I haven't read the code. So
Okay.
okay, I will try and start that code at some point, because more and more I'm thinking it would be good to have this functionality.
Honestly, it could be like worth just empirically validating it as well. Start Osquery up with a schedule, turn the logs on, and see when it runs those queries.
Yeah.
And you could do it with like a minute interval probably, and look at how close to the end of the minute it runs, or 10 minutes if you really feel like you need to see it.
I will try and figure that out. I just more and more think that having a run at startup functionality would be starting to see all kinds of neat things that we can't do without it.
I'm definitely on board with that. I'm more skeptical of the idea of separating that from the scheduling mechanism entirely, but it sounds like maybe if my interpretation is correct here, then maybe your concern that caused you to want to do that is also alleviated.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I think so. One of the ideas I realized, like, it's come up a few times, is that you can use views inside Osquery.
Yeah.
But you can't have any queries run before the view's created. So that creates this, either you stick the view and the query together, which you can do, but that's kind of ugly SQL, or you have to make sure that the view runs before any queries that use it run. So that starts creating this, well, what if we, would you want a config section for views, or just a section of run these things on startup? Possibly an integer priority order too. So you can be like, cool, create all the views, always make sure I get like host name and, OS version on startup, and then move on with life.
That's
So
definitely interesting. I mean, when it comes to the views use case, then I almost do lean more towards what you described with the separate.
well, they just wouldn't. I think it's important that we have separate configuration stanzas, not stanzas, options on a query. So, or is it not pack? I forget where we hang schedule right now.
Schedule is both. There's both a like global schedule and then in packs.
Is it on queries or only at the pack level?
Sorry. Oh, is the schedule on the schedule is on each individual query within a pack.
Oh, good, perfect. Yeah, I think we should gain an integer run at boot there too. And if it's not set, then it doesn't run at boot. And
Yeah, that works for me.
and then how it affects schedule sounds like I should go do some code reading and verification.
Yeah.
I'll maybe open a blueprint issue when I get a little closer on this one.
Yeah.
But yeah, this one I keep finding use cases, and I'm like, oh, I could bake it all into Launcher, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's maybe all the things floating around my head right now. I don't know if anyone else wants to chat about stuff or anything.
I sort of have a topic, but it isn't fleshed out yet. This is like very much unbaked. It's related to endpoint security, but having endpoint security events defined at runtime by the config. Because there are so many events now. So I haven't even done much like reading or kind of doing a POC, but there's some interest in this kind of work where a config can say, hey, get me like OpenSSH login, logout events or screen share events or something. And it's like given to you at config time, and kind of like the endpoint security publisher subscriber knows that, and then it maps it to like what version it's available on Mac OS version, and then kind of grabs all the data and just spits it out. But the columns can be a little bit different. The PID and the path, and those are the common ones, but some events have like certain special columns. So I'm still kind of tinkering with that idea, but there is some interest in having this functionality in the future.
Is it like, are you saying that you're interested in making sort of a generic endpoint security events table, or would these be split out into new separate tables?
This
for
would
each
be
of
kind of the generic table. So there, we already have process events and file events, and we are not going to touch those. So there'll be one like user specified events where you can say like, get me, background task management event, or get me touch ID events, or get me SSH login logout events, or get me axe adder events. So there are certain columns that are common across all, but there are then special ones. Again, this conversation just started, and I haven't even like dug into it, but I don't know if this is something that will be like doing it in the core. Can we do it in the core? So I just wanted to get this going. I'll probably open up a blueprint issue if this conversation moves forward ahead.
Cool.
But it'd be kind of neat to have it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would prefer to see dedicated tables for each of those things,
Okay.
but I'm open to the idea of having a more generic table as well. Like we do that for Windows events.
I might go the other way than Zach does. And I might be wrong. If you tell me that there are a million different kinds of events, I don't want a million tables. So I like the idea of an endpoint security events table that then you have to configure which things you listen to. And I then have questions. And I don't know that I'm right, so Zach might be right. I wonder if this would be something like, would you do this in the config file, or would you follow sort of some of the other evented tables where, like, as soon as a query runs, it starts listening for whatever's in that query? And I don't know which is more sort of friendly, both as a user and as a developer. Like, some degree, whatever is easier to write.
So part of the answer is that this has to be kind of defined before like the publisher starts, before we kind of create the endpoint security client. So it has to be as a flag file.
So it be in the config, or does it have to be in the flags?
I'm not 100% sure on this right now, but I think it'll have to be in the flags.
I wonder if it's possible to like reopen the endpoint security client or something with the new
Yeah,
flags.
yeah. So the idea is to have a separate endpoint security client, and that's how Apple kind of recommends it. That's how other folks also do it. Like if you're bucketing certain events, so we already have one client for processes, one client for FIM, and then we'll have third client, which would be kind of generic. Where
Well, actually, why don't you go even further then? You know, because let's imagine. Can you give me 2 event examples?
sorry, what examples?
Two kinds of events as an example.
The login event. So when you use like OpenSSH or sudo or su.
Great. What's another one?
Background persistence, so BTM, attach, detach, those kind of things.
Okay, cool. Those both sound really cool to me. If I wanted to enable them both, what would that look like? Would that basically need to create one endpoint security client for each? Would we create?
So now there'll be one client for both those kind of events. So we already have 2 clients, for one for processes and one for files, and that's kind of the recommended way to do it.
Well, I mean, does it make sense to create? I'm thinking, if I wanted to specify that I wanted login events with the columns XYZ, and I wanted BTM events with the columns ABC, is it easier to create 2 endpoint security clients? Does that give you like a better route to ingesting it from a config file, or from a, like, you know, first time it's seen in a query kind of thing?
I'm not sure. I'll have to flesh that out. But it's also, we also do not want to proliferate too many clients, because there's a system-wide cap of 64, and Apple has reserved 16 for their own use. This is not documented at all. It's just by reverse engineering that I know this. And Apple stands as a handful of, clients is okay in your program. They don't give you a number, but 64 is the system limit, and 16 of those are reserved for Apple's own use as of today. So I don't want someone to be able to misconfigure it where each separate event is a separate client, where like a sudo login event is another client, sudo logout event is another client.
That makes sense.
Charvel, is that link that I posted, the events? Like I just some of the ones that you mentioned I don't see in that.
Let me get you a better documentation for that.
I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, these will all be like notification events. So, and yeah, these don't list. Sorry, Zach, these don't list all the events. But if you like load the Xcode header, it has the other events.
Oh, interesting. I think maybe I found the page that includes other ones, because then I see OpenSSH. That's event type T.
So I don't know why I linked to the fork one, but yeah. So sorry, Seth, you were kind of saying something.
I was mostly saying I think the idea of one table versus many tables is interesting, and maybe a question is, I feel like we talked about this a couple of times, but I feel like we have this sort of, we should think about how to unify the various audit style tables, right? Because we have like we have an ES processes, and then we have like a Linux processes. So I feel like if I chew on that, I feel like, I don't know. I keep wondering, like, do I want an endpoint security table for each type, or do I want one endpoint security events table and then like a process events table that can be unified cross-platform? And I don't know. So I don't know. I almost wonder if maybe I'm just saying I'm kind of good with whatever way you think makes sense, and maybe some bias around whether things get their own table is whether you think they'll eventually be cross-platform. But I'm kind of curious where Zach lands too.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm definitely open to seeing, what the proposal is that Charvel comes up with. I think that these audit style tables are tricky cross-platform because we're like so restricted to what the APIs provide on each platform. It's like harder. It's harder than with something like a general processes table where we end up being able to find ways to abstract
I
a lot of
agree.
the columns.
This is a place I struggle to. I'm like, would it be good to have a single process events that was the lowest common denominator? And if you wanted the platform specific ones, you could go use the platform specific ones, or are we just making work for ourselves by having that? But, like today, I find it very hard to understand and think about how it evaluate it, because you really have to understand all of the possible tables and permutations. They're not even, and then because we prefix them with the subsystem, it's very hard to even find them all. So, it's sort of what process events, ES process events. I don't know. I'd have to go search the schema. So I don't know. I think there's something here to untangle a bit around how we make these a little easier to use. Anyhow, I think it's a great idea. However it turns out.
Yeah, and like I said, I've done like zero research. This conversation has just started, and this idea has just kind of come up. So, yeah, I'll have more time to do it in the next few weeks during Thanksgiving and the holidays to kind of dive in and figure out a game plan.
I think we also have talked about doing that for BPF, and I don't remember where that landed. The BPF work might be kind of on the back burner somewhere, but I'm not sure. Other things? If not, we can call it half an hour early. Okay. Thank you all for being here and contributing in the myriad of ways. So.
All right. Thank you, Seth.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.